Great. Hey, Maria.
Hello.
And we are on Facebook Live. So thanks everyone for your patience. I'm trying to figure out the video thing again. So I appreciate it. This time we're only 3 minutes late. So wonderful. Maria, welcome. I'll give you just a quick second to, I'll give you a second in a few minutes to introduce yourself. But for folks who are watching for the first time, my name is Angelica Rubio. I represent District 35 here in the city of Las Cruces. And as many of you know, I ride my bike up to Santa Fe every year. And unfortunately, this year is not at all possible due to COVID-19 and us taking this issue really, really seriously. And with that said, I still wanted to make sure that the town halls, which were really important to me as I rode my bike up to Santa Fe, that the spirit of those town halls and connecting Southern New Mexico to Santa Fe was still a part of was still a part of the process. And so tonight is the third town hall that I host, and I am really excited to talk about it because I feel like every single bill that I will either sponsor as a primary sponsor or co-sponsor has a direct correlation amongst like there's certainly a lot of threading around the intersectionalities between all of the bills that we are carrying. And this one specifically that we're going to talk about first is modernizing our housing code here in New Mexico. I will certainly let Maria introduce herself and share more about our history here in New Mexico and when it comes to housing, and then as well as what we're proposing. But just to lay out some context for folks watching, when we first, when this whole situation with COVID began here in the state of New Mexico, Representative Andrea Romero and myself, and Andrea wasn't able to join us tonight because she had another commitment, is that when we were in one of our first meetings with our other legislative colleagues, her and I really started to think about what's going to happen to folks and their shelter if one of the things that we're expected to do is stay at home. And we became very, very concerned. And within a few weeks, we really were able to connect with a lot of our relationships across the state and form a working group. And this working group has been meeting every other week for the past, I don't know, like 10 months. I guess it was around March, April. And we tried really hard to get some of our ideas into the special session in June. And again, at the end of the year, it's really taken us many, many months to really get housing to be a priority, I think, for many legislators as well as the administration. As we approach the legislative session next week, there are concerns with some of the funding or the budgets that have been proposed so far, particularly from the governor's budget, as well as what's been proposed by the legislature to address issues related to funding. And so we can talk a little bit about that. But overall, I really wanted to spend the time talking about what is in the legislation that we're proposing, legislation that has really been brought forth by organizations from across the state who have, and advocates from across the state who have been working for many, many years to address issues related to housing. And so here we are approaching a legislative session. And so, Maria, I wanted to get a chance to finally introduce you. If you want to take a moment to say one, welcome, and then also just share a little bit about who you are and why this work is so important to you, and how it's connected to what we're trying to accomplish at the upcoming session.
Thank you, Representative. So good to see you as always, and thank you for having me attend tonight. It's always a pleasure. My name is Maria Grego. I'm the Director of Economic Equity at the New Mexico Center on Law and Poverty and a supervising attorney there. And on the economic equity team, amongst other things, we work on housing issues. And it's fairly new work. This work is fairly new to the center. And I think the reason we decided to get into housing work is because we realize that there's a real disconnect and a real lack of housing work being done on a coordinated effort across the state. So there are a lot of advocates out there who care about housing and are working on it. But unfortunately, in New Mexico, we don't have a single statewide entity or agency that's responsible for housing across the whole spectrum of housing. So we do have the Mortgage Finance Authority, but they are really a funding entity. And so, as you said, thank you for reaching out last year early on in the pandemic, knowing that we were going to have a housing crisis. And it was through your call that a group of us have coalesced, and we've been working for 10 months to figure out what we can do to prevent an even worse housing crisis in New Mexico.
Thanks so much, Maria. And I think what's really important for folks who are watching, what's really important to understand is that COVID has just unveiled to us so many inequities. Many of us who have been organizing or advocates or activists who have been grounded in a lot of the issues impacting our communities, we've known for a very long time that there are inequities in our communities, especially when it comes to issues related to housing. And COVID, I think, has really unleashed this new level of visibility, I think, for housing, which has been great, but but there's still a lot of work to do. As I mentioned, from what we can tell, just briefly from reviewing the governor's budget that was released, not a whole lot of money is going to be invested in housing in the way that we thought. And so these are some of the concerns that we have certainly moving forward. And we know that over the course of the next couple months, as the legislative session, I mean, depending on what happens, I know that there's a lot of health risks with us dealing with the legislative session, especially with the Senate still meeting in person. But then on top of that, all these security issues that are occurring with state capitals across the country. Clearly things may change or we'll have to adapt, but housing is certainly my priority. It's certainly, I think, Representative Romero's priority. And for folks watching, it's incredibly important that you all stay informed about what is happening, and we will do our best to inform you all. But things will change rapidly, and it's really, the work is to try to make sure that housing is also a priority for our legislators and the governor's office. So Maria, I just wanted to see if you could provide us with an overview of what we are trying to accomplish. For those watching and listening, there's a ton of things that we wanted to try to accomplish at this upcoming session, things that we wanted to accomplish back during the special session. But what we decided as a coalition was to really try to fundamentally reform some of the gaps that we see as really impacting communities now, but that we could actually make some significant strides in the beginning. And so Maria, if you wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. As I mentioned before, and as you mentioned, Representative, New Mexico was already in a housing crisis before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. Our state had the largest increase in homelessness between 2018 and 2019, a 27% increase. And we also had the highest increase in chronic homelessness nationwide, an increase of over 57%. And so we've only seen that housing crisis exacerbated by COVID. So before COVID, there was an average of 16 families, New Mexico families a day being evicted. And when COVID hit, there were some eviction protections put into place. So the New Mexico Supreme Court, for example, issued a stay on evictions, which means if you can't pay rent and you provide evidence to the court, you can stay in your home. The court will rule against you, but you can stay in your home for the time being. But evictions are still taking place. And so the group of us that's been working together with your help, like I said, you coalesced us around this issue. We've really taken a hard look at New Mexico housing law to identify where are the gaps, where are the problems, what can be, what are some concrete things that we can fix to make sure that New Mexicans can stay safely housed, not just now, but after the pandemic, that we are bouncing back as a state. And what we've realized is that the New Mexico Housing Code, the Uniform Owner Resident Relations Act, really has really strong, really weak protections for tenants in comparison to protections for landlords. And so the work that we've done is to try and balance out those protections. So, for example, under New Mexico law, and this is rare, we're unlike most other states. If a tenant, doesn't pay their rent and they get a notice, and that they have to pay the rent within 3 days. If they don't pay their rent within 3 days, the landlord can file and take them to court. At any time after that 3-day notice expires or before court, it doesn't matter if a tenant pays their rent. The tenant could walk to the landlord's house the next day and pay them the full amount of rent, the filing fees, any late fees, and the landlord could still evict them. Which seems really, it's really perplexing that we would allow that under the law, that even though the tenant is fully up to date on rent, a landlord could still evict them for non-payment. And like I said, that's just not the case in most other states. And so one of the big protections is we are asking to expand the time frame so tenants have more time from the day their landlord gives them notice to pay. So 10 days instead of 3 days. Hoping that most tenants would get another paycheck in that time frame. And then if at any time before they go to court, if the tenant is able to pay back rent, late fees, costs, they can stay in their home. And similarly, even after the court rules against them, anytime before the sheriff shows up to your door to have you removed, if you pay that off, you can stay in your home. So that's just New Mexico families they're not uprooted. Evictions are much more than just having to move to a new apartment or home. Often families have to sever ties with their communities. Kids have to leave a school that they've come to know and that they're established in, or childcare. For families that rely on public transportation, they might have to find a new job because their new home might be too far away to get to from public transportation. Evictions have long-lasting and deep-cutting consequences, and so we're really trying to broaden those protections. But there are several other protections, and I don't know how much time you have, Representative. I could go on, but yeah, several other protections would be in this bill.
I think one of the other pieces that I think would be really good for you to explain, because I think folks don't also, I know that I was surprised when it happened, was in terms of the issue related to income. Like, what is the income that landlords are willing to accept or not accept, and the rights that renters have? And the reason that I'd like for you to share a little bit about that is because of what you just said, which is the consequences of what losing your shelter means for the greater community. And I think this has been one of the most difficult conversations that I've had to have with folks, especially leading up to the legislative session, where we have people who are already beginning to oppose the legislation without actually reading it, because many renters especially don't have the kind of rights that landlords do. And so we absolutely do not want to create a division between landlords and renters. That's not what this legislation is about. It just really means, what's that equal footing? And I think the income piece is really important for folks to understand, that even though someone may not have a consistent income from like a job, but they have supplemental income that is consistent, that even that wouldn't be considered a way to help pay for their rent.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and you're absolutely Representative. You know, as I said earlier, the goal of this bill is to really sort of balance out the rights of landlords and tenants. And we certainly do care about landlords. New Mexico is just different than other states. A lot of our landlords here are mom and pop landlords who own just a couple of properties and really rely on the rent they receive to either pay their own mortgage or, you know, put food on the table. So it's certainly not a landlord or tenants against landlords, you know, discussion here. We're really looking to make balance out the rights of both parties. And as you were talking about the source of income discrimination, so in New Mexico, there is no prohibition against discriminating against tenants based on how they pay their rent. So if a tenant, for example, has a Section 8 voucher and can, you know, their rent will be paid, they will pay a portion and the other portion is subsidized. Landlords can refuse to rent, and under New Mexico law, can refuse to rent to someone simply because they're paying with a voucher. Similarly, a landlord could discriminate for someone because part of their income is child support or Social Security income. And that's really unfair, especially to low income families. As long as your source of, you know, your income is from a lawful source, it shouldn't matter how you pay your rent. And so that's been a long-standing problem. We've been hearing about that from advocates for a long time, but it really came to light during COVID. And how we saw that sort of play out is now with you know, with so many people, so many New Mexicans losing their jobs, many you know, state, local, you know, city entities as well as nonprofits have had to step up and provide, you know, rental assistance funds, create rental assistance funds, so that they can help families stay in their home who just through no fault of their own can't pay their rent right now. And for some unknown reason, we've heard multiple reports of landlords refusing to accept rental assistance from these entities, from nonprofits who literally are writing a check to the landlord saying, here's a check on behalf of this tenant. And they're saying, no, we don't have to take it. And they don't under New Mexico law. They don't have to take it. You know, and so one of the goals of this legislation is to make it illegal to discriminate. You know, if there's lawful income, you have to take it from a tenant so that they can stay housed. And again, this goes back to broadening those timeframes. Right now, a tenant only has 3 days to pay their rent from the day their landlord gives them the notice. That's just simply not enough time if you have to go apply for rental assistance. Often it takes, I would say, at least a week for most of these programs to get funding. So broadening that time, so you get a notice, you now have 10 days, so you can go apply for rental assistance, and it will require the landlord to take that money so that you can't be because a third party is paying your rent.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing, Maria, because I think that is one of the big pieces, or at least components of why legislation like this is so critical, is that I think folks have assumed that there is going to be this incredible overhaul of our housing system, which I would personally support. But unfortunately, that's not what we're trying to accomplish. If anything, there is just so many little pieces that could make such a significant difference in people's lives, both in the landlord and tenant relationship. And so my hope is that as we introduce this legislation, we're hoping to finalize the language over the course of the next few days, that we can get this language introduced and hopefully get the kind of support that we need. We know that the funding piece is always a long shot, that the funding that is required to fully fund folks across the state is always going to be up for debate. But systemically, if we're really wanting to make long-lasting change, systemic change, that it's the components that are within this bill that are going to be really critical. And so folks who are watching and who are listening, and who are living in shelter gratefully, who have a place to stay tonight, and most nights, that that you really think about how you can engage in the political process, in the legislative process as we move into the legislative session. Please, by contacting your legislators, making sure that this is the kind of legislation that they're willing to support, because we are in a global pandemic right now that is requiring people to stay home as much as possible, but it's impossible to do so when they are risking they're losing their shelter. And so that is very, very critical. And so I encourage you all to please follow the course in which this legislation takes shape. Once we introduce it, I will certainly provide information when we have the number for the House bill as soon as we have it, and we'll certainly be making some call to actions as things start to move and the bill is sent to committees and it starts to navigate both the House and the Senate. Maria, do you have anything else that you'd like to share before we move on to another big idea, which is paid sick leave?
Yeah, no, just I guess one other thing I would just touch on. You mentioned, the funding. One good thing is that there has been a good influx of money recently that came to the state, to the Mortgage Finance Authority, to provide rental assistance, $200 million. But the problem is, because several landlords are not accepting that rental assistance, there's a possibility that MFA could have to sit on that money and or return it to the federal government. And that would be a shame, to send back so much money to be used to strengthen our state and our economy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. For folks who are watching, whether you're a renter or a landlord, please, if you have any questions about some of the federal funding that has come to New Mexico and has ended up at the Mortgage Finance Authority to help distribute some of this, there is there is a bottleneck in terms of landlords for some reason not returning phone calls or returning mail or and I know that there's sometimes when you get calls from the government, people are freaked out. So I get it. But when it comes to issues like this, please follow through and help the system out, help your communities out, and make sure that you're accessing this funding because it really is I mean, there's funding out there to support so many communities. The question is whether or not we can actually get that funding distributed. So Maria, thanks so much. I really appreciate all the work that you've done over the course of the last 10 months on this issue and even before that. And anything that you all feel free to ever, sometimes I keep pretending that this thing has become a show, like, oh my God, welcome to my show. But if there's anything that I can do on my on my platform, please feel free. I'm a big fan of the center and all the work that you all do. So thank you.
And thank you for your leadership. Really, you one together. So thank you.
No, thanks so much, Maria. I appreciate it. So you all, next we have paid sick leave. And so I know that a lot of folks have been really reaching out in terms of some of the work that we're doing around that issue. And if you're not familiar with paid sick leave, I will certainly be preparing some information. Oops, I'm sorry, I made the wrong person participant. I'm trying to bring on Abraham Sanchez. Abraham Sanchez is works for New Mexico Cafe, which is Comunidades en Acción y de Fe. And it is the organization that I formerly worked for back in the day. And so I'm really excited to have him come on, as he is one of the Cafe is one of the organizations that is really spearheading some of the work around paid sick leave. So Abraham, welcome to Angelica Show, to Rubio, to Pedaling for the People, Town Hall number 3.
And no, thank you so much, Representative. I'm live with Rubio. I feel honored to be here, actually. But no, thank you. In all seriousness, thank you for having me here. And more importantly, thank you for your commitment and all of the leadership you provide in our state for working families. Yeah, as you mentioned, I'm Abraham Sanchez. I work for New Mexico Cafe. I've been a community organizer now for just over a couple of years. But yeah, we do community organizing work across 4 different counties in southern New Mexico for racial, social, and economic justice. And so I think it's really fitting to be in this place tonight talking about this, because this is absolutely concerned with justice for working families right now.
Awesome. Thanks, Abraham. And for folks who are watching and listening either on Zoom or on Facebook Live, please use the comments on Facebook Live to ask any questions, either for the housing piece. I'll try to answer the best that I can on the housing piece. And for sure on this paid sick leave, we have about half an hour to really talk about the paid sick leave, how it impacts our communities, and all of that. For Zoom, I would recommend folks to, if you have any questions, to add it in the Q&A at the bottom, and I will certainly review and watch out for all of that. So before we get started on some of the work that you all are doing at Cafe Abraham, I just wanted to give folks an overview of paid sick leave, and it's pretty straightforward. But first and foremost, just to give you all some context, is that generally the work that has been done at the state level has been mostly related to wages, and really we're looking at the minimum wage, working towards statewide minimum wage. And so a lot of the work that's been done on paid sick leave has been happening more at the local level. And this is one we realized a few weeks ago that this could possibly be the very first time that statewide paid sick leave is introduced at the New Mexico State Legislature. And so for me, that is a really big deal. And this is something that I've been saying over the course of the last few nights, is that I am operating from a place of that as we transition into this legislative session next week, that for me, it will be, in my opinion, hopefully a transformative legislative session. I feel like there's so many people, like organizations like Cafe and others, who have been working diligently for years and years and years trying to get some of these very basic and, in my opinion, really straightforward rights. Like this isn't hard to do. And so I'm really excited about the potential that we have to really make some systemic changes, like the housing bill that we just talked about, and a lot of the other bills that I've described over the course of the last couple of days. And so with the paid sick leave bill, it's pretty simple. There's 4 components to the bill. It's the coverage itself, the accrual, the usage, and then the enforcement. And so in terms of the coverage, it's again, it's straightforward. All employers shall provide paid sick leave to all workers who work at least 56 hours in a year, including part-time, seasonal, or temporary basis. That, I think the latter part of that is super important, because especially when it comes to seasonal workers, farm workers, for example, and a few other employee type folks are usually exempt from a lot of these coverages. And so this is a really important piece of the legislation, is that everyone is included by this. Nobody will be left out. The second is accrual, that workers earn 1 hour of sick time for every 30 hours that they work. And then in terms of the usage, they can accrue and use 56 hours per year. And then in terms of the enforcement, and this is the piece that's going to be really important, because as many of you may know or not know, when I worked for Cafe, I was the lead organizer and campaign manager for the minimum wage here in Las Cruces. When we raised the wage to 10.10, there's other campaigns that have happened across the state where have been really, really successful. But this is the portion of a lot of legislation that gets stuck at times, is that we can pass a bill or we can pass a resolution, and yet that there's no teeth to it. And so for us, this component to this bill is probably the most important, because we're basically saying that the state must investigate complaints and enforce the ordinance. So if a worker the worker would have a private right of action, or say an individual can sue their employer if there's issues with their paid sick leave. This is an important piece for me, based on a lot of the work that we've all done, through really uplifting workers and workers' justice. This is by far the most important piece of this legislation, is that it's one thing to provide the paid sick leave, but the other thing is to enforce it. And so our hope, and it's something that I will make sure that it stays intact, is that the enforcement piece remains in the legislation. And so Abraham, for every time I say Abraham, I always think of Selena. And so I don't know, Abraham, I wanted to talk to you about, and I'm glad that you all were able to come on, is really just to hear more about the stories, because right now I feel like, I mean, legislation is legislation and policy is policy, but that's not really what connects a lot of people to these issues. It's really like, how does this legislation really impact communities that we are serving? As we mentioned with the housing piece, I mean, there's so many consequences for a person to lose their shelter. And their shelter in terms of like the strings that they have to cut with their community, young people in their schools, things like that. In the work that we're doing with paid sick leave, what are some of the stories that you're hearing on the ground around how this is going to really impact people's lives?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Representative. I think it's a great question because, yeah, really, I think oftentimes when you see organizations like CAFE out front supporting things like this, the part that can sometimes get lost in all of this is those real connections, those human stories. And so really the part that a lot of people don't often see is that the real lifeblood of organizing is about building deep relationships with people who are directly impacted. And so that's actually what we've spent a lot of time doing. And I wish I could say that all of this is just born out of the last year because of COVID and everything. I think COVID has definitely highlighted a lot of the reasons why we need to push for these kinds of changes. But the reality is working people and working families have had a really rough go of things for a long time, even before COVID. And so really throughout like I said, I've been organizing now for a couple of years, but really for a long time now, in those relationships we have, and that we are constantly trying to cultivate and build with people who are directly impacted, we're able to really hear the stories from people and why these things are so important. So for me, I mean, I just feel honored often actually to hear the stories from people, but it's just such a wide array of people and stories that we hear. So normally when we think about paid sick leave, we do think about things, you know, if you have a cold or something like that. And those are the reasons why it's important for us to have that. And absolutely that I think is really at the front of this. But really a bill like this supports all the different kinds of ways that workers can be not well for any reason and not be able to go to work. So we hear stories of everything from whether it's survivors of domestic abuse, people who suffer from mental illness and mental health patients. We hear from people who actually have chronic illnesses, things that they actually have to deal with regularly. And we also hear lots of stories actually about people who are in need of taking care of family members often. COVID is definitely one of those times that highlights this, but really very often you have situations where people may have siblings or parents or things where those loved ones of ours, they need care. And I don't know how we can continue or that it's sustainable to have a workforce in our state that is not allowed to be sick all too often. So what we find very often, especially with agricultural workers, especially folks out in the fields, things like that, really what we hear is, and it's heartbreaking to hear stories from people who say, yeah, we are not allowed to be sick, or we have to make a decision between our family and our job, or we have to make a decision between being well and going to work. And really, it's actually in those places where it highlights the reality that this is not good for workers, and it's also not good for employers, actually, to make people go into work when they're not well, potentially infecting other folks too, and spreading illness around as well. All of these are reasons why it's so important that we don't do these things, and that we give people the ability to just take care of themselves. But I will highlight one story that I think is really important when we think about this, and because I'm reminded of New Mexico Cafe has had a really, just a really great line of awesome female leaders who really understand what a lot of this stuff is about. And so our current executive director, and I refer to her as our executive organizer, Joana Bencomo, one of the things that she lifted up well over a year ago was, if you remember this debate, I guess, that arose about who has the best green chili, right? Colorado or New Mexico. And obviously I'm from New Mexico, and I've even worked in a chili plant before, so I have a little bit of a bias, but I think even if I didn't, I would know the truth there, right? But in all seriousness, what our executive organizer lifted up was this reality of it's such a ridiculous debate to have about who has better green chili, whether Colorado or New Mexico, when really the debate should be about who takes the best care of those workers who work their butts off to put food on our tables, actually. And so when I think about this paid sick leave bill, it's actually similar, if not exactly the same as the paid sick leave policy that already exists in Colorado. And so it's for these reasons, when we think about who's feeding us, all the people we've applied these terms as essential to throughout the year, if they're so essential, then why do we not have policies in place that allow them to take care of themselves and their families? And so as well, when we think about those foods, those things, even for servers in restaurants and things like that, right, is what does it say about where our values are if we don't actually advocate for policies that allow those people to take care of themselves? And so to me, I find that really important. I spend a lot of time with talking with different workers, including workers in Hatch, where that awesome chili is actually grown, and then also in the surrounding areas. And every time I talk with these folks, it just makes it more and more clear every day that New Mexico is a place that is absolutely worthy of all of these types of things that we see in other states where they are willing to take care of their workers. I think very highly of our workers in New Mexico, and so I have a very high standard for how I believe that they should be treated. And so it is really exciting to see legislation like this that actually is keeping those things in mind right now.
Yeah. No, thanks, Abraham. And I agree. I mean, my parents were both farm workers, and if they were, I mean, my dad's 83 years old, and if he could still work right now, I mean, he still kind of does, except he just had his heart surgery. But it's really like our families, right? Our families who would greatly benefit from these what they are entitled to. And that's the thing that people are not willing to grapple with when it comes to issues like this, is that this shouldn't have to be a debate. Paid sick leave and giving people what they deserve, having a job that not only pays them what their a dignified wage, but also the fact that they actually deserve time off if they're sick. Like, I think like it, to me, it still blows my mind that this is still a debate that has to happen, that people just don't recognize the importance of having healthy workers when it comes to their to having a good livelihood. And so I raise that because as we enter this legislative session in just a few days, that part of the ongoing narratives that we've been hearing for 80, 70, 80, 90 years when it comes to protections for workers, those same narratives that we heard back in the 30s and 40s are the same narratives that we will hear today, that we will break businesses, that we will uh like there's all kinds of things that will take shape. And the bottom line is, and it's what we've seen time and time again, is it's actually these policies that really provide not only solutions for employees, but it actually makes employers that much better. And so I really want to just applaud the work that's been going on by organizations who, like Cafe and others, who have really done the kind of work necessary to really bring this issue straight forward. And so thanks, Abraham, for being a part of this work. and just your commitment to this effort. We have folks on Zoom, and so and on Facebook Live. And so I would really ask folks, if you have any questions, whether it's related to the housing piece or related to the sick leave piece, to the paid sick leave, please add them to the Q&A or add them to the comments on Facebook Live, and we're happy to answer those questions. For folks who are wondering, related to the paid sick leave and to the housing bill, the paid sick leave has already been introduced, and so you can find the information on the bill at www.nmlegis.gov. And if you just scroll through and just go to legislator, which is me, and then you can just go and click on this upcoming session, the legislation should already be available for you to read. And as I mentioned, it's pretty straightforward. There's 4 components. There are a couple of there is one other paid sick leave bill that is being introduced, and excuse me, my hope is that ours will still continue to be the priority bill moving forward into the session, and that it will make it through the House and the Senate, and that it signs and that it be signed by the governor. This is a request that I'm making to you all tonight, that as you're watching, that if you care about workers and essential workers, especially folks who've been on the front lines over the course of the last 10 years, last 10 months and beyond, that if you care about the people that are feeding us, who are providing us the nourishment that we need to live every single day, especially during this global pandemic, that they too deserve to not have to choose between a paycheck and their health. And those are the choices that people are having to make every single day when we are, as we've been dealing with this global pandemic. In terms of the housing, we will be finalizing that legislation over the course of the next few days, and that legislation will be public as well. One thing that I didn't get to mention, and I will mention it now, is that, and Maria, I think, might have mentioned it just briefly, is that we, aside from MFA, which is the Mortgage Financing Authority, which is the one that distributes most of the funding related to housing in the state, outside of that, there is no one entity that oversees the housing process, that oversees housing in New Mexico. And so there was talk back and forth about whether or not we should create a department related to housing, or whether we should create an entity related to housing. And in the end, what we've decided is to really think about a person that would be designated underneath the governor's office to really oversee, to coordinate with all state agencies on this issue around housing, because we know that when somebody's housing is impacted, their shelter is impacted, there's direct correlation with issues related to education, higher ed, economic development, issues with CYFD. And so we're working on incorporating that into the legislation, and we're hoping for support in addition to all the fundamental things that we talked about earlier. So with that, you all, I don't see any questions coming in from Facebook Live. I don't see any questions coming in from Zoom. And so it looks like you all want me to have a 15-minute break and maybe dinner tonight. So thank you all for participating in tonight's call, or tonight's town hall. Abraham, thank you so much for joining me tonight, and for Maria, who was here earlier. For folks who are interested in the legislative session, as I mentioned last week, or last night, we are in the process of figuring out what's going to happen with the legislative session next week. There's a lot of concerns around public safety. And so I just wanted to be very clear that We have been briefed. We have been informed of some of the precautions that are going to be taken in preparation for the legislative session next week. And so I just want to be able to be fully transparent that there are steps that are being taken to make sure that not only are the legislators going to be protected, there's to protect it and all of that, but so is the staff, the public who will be still allowed to participate outside the roundhouse. Of course, reporters and media will be allowed as well, and then that all of that is actively being taken care of. But one thing that I shared on social media this morning on Twitter is that there are cowards out there who, specifically the one that's currently occupying the White House, who incited an insurrection last week. And there are his minions that exist in state capitals all across the country, including ours. And so I am concerned that a lot of things could potentially happen. But then there's also the potential that nothing happens. And so we are just kind of we're just kind of holding our breath to see what happens next week. But the one thing that I want folks to understand, and I know that I'm not alone with other legislators, is that we were elected to make some transformative efforts to change New Mexico for the better. And it is important for folks to understand that folks like myself and many others in the House of Representatives and in the Senate are committed to showing up next week and doing what we need to do to represent our communities, because that's why we were elected and that's why we're here. And so I ask you all to just send all your positive energy to the folks who are going to be up in Santa Fe, but that we're not also deterred from doing what we were asked to do, what we are demanded to do, and that is to really make some transformative change for our communities. And so with that, please, thanks again for joining me tonight. Tomorrow, I will be having an entire hour on just broadband, because I know that is a big deal for a lot of folks. I am working with 6 other legislators in the House of Representatives on a comprehensive bill to address issues around broadband. We had a meeting with Governor Lujan Grisham yesterday, and we were really excited about some of her feedback on this legislation. And so I'm looking forward to sharing more on what we are planning to accomplish over the course of the next legislative session related to that. So with that, thank you all for attending tonight's town hall, and I will talk to you all soon. Have a good night.